On the 14th of August 2024, a small team of geologists sat in front of a computer screen in Perth, Australia, and stared at a result they did not believe. They ran the test again, then a third time. The number did not change. The altar stone, the great flat slab buried at the very heart of Stonehenge, the stone every textbook for 100 years said came from Wales, was not Welsh at all. Its chemical fingerprint matched rock from the far northeast of Scotland, more than 700 kilometers away. For over a century, archaeologists had built an entire story about how Stonehenge was made, who made it, and how far Neolithic people were capable of traveling. That story just collapsed in a laboratory in Western Australia, and nobody in the field saw it coming. This is not speculation dressed up as science. This is a peer-reviewed discovery published in the journal Nature, and it forces us to ask a question that should terrify anyone who thought we understood this monument. If we were wrong about where the most important stone at Stonehenge came from, what else have we been wrong about for the last 100 years? Stonehenge sits on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, roughly 130 kilometers southwest of London. It did not appear all at once. The site began around 3000 BCE as a circular ditch and bank enclosure, a modest earthwork with wooden posts. It was not until roughly 2500 BCE that the massive stones we recognize today were dragged into position, shaped, and raised into the trilithon arrangement that has defined the skyline of Salisbury Plain for 4,500 years. The monument was modified repeatedly over the following 1500 years. Stones moved, removed, and rearranged by generations, who clearly still considered this ground sacred long after its original builders were gone. Archaeologists classify the stones into three main types. The sarsens are the giants, the sandstone uprights and lintels that can weigh up to 25 tons and stand over 9 meters tall. The bluestones are smaller, spotted volcanic rocks weighing up to 4 tons each, forming an inner arrangement. And then there is the altar stone, a single, flat sandstone slab lying at the center of the monument, nearly 5 meters long, that for 100 years was assumed to be just one more bluestone that happened to come from Wales. That assumption is exactly what just fell apart. None of these breakthroughs happened by someone standing at the monument and looking harder. They happened in laboratories, using geophysical survey equipment, ground-penetrating radar, LIDAR aerial mapping, and mass spectrometers that can read the age of a single mineral grain thinner than a human hair. Over the last 15 years, English heritage and university teams have quietly turned Stonehenge and the landscape around it into one of the most intensively scanned archaeological sites on the planet, and the results keep forcing textbook rewrites. This is the real story behind every viral headline about Stonehenge being decoded by modern technology. Not mysticism, not ancient aliens, but patient, unglamorous laboratory science finally catching up to a monument that has been keeping its secrets for 4,500 years. Before we get to the altar stone, we need to understand how researchers even work out where a 4,500-year-old rock came from in the first place, because the answer is more forensic than most people expect. In 2020, a team led by geologist David Nash at the University of Brighton tackled the sarsens, the giant stones, using a technique borrowed from oil exploration. They used portable X-ray fluorescence scanners on 52 of the surviving sarsen stones to build a chemical signature for each one. Then they compared those signatures to a core sample that had been drilled out of one of the stones back in 1958 during a repair, a core that had spent decades forgotten in a museum drawer in the United States before being returned to Britain. When the lab results came back, 50 of the 52 sarsens matched a single source, a wooded area called West Woods, about 25 kilometers north of Stonehenge. For the first time in the monument's modern history, researchers could say with real confidence exactly where the giant stones came from. And the answer was surprisingly local. That success is what set the stage for an even bigger question. If the giant sarsens came from 25 kilometers away, where did the smaller, stranger bluestones come from, and how did they get there? The bluestone answer had actually been suspected since the 1920s, when geologist Herbert Thomas identified their distinctive spotted dolerite as coming from the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales, roughly 240 kilometers from Salisbury Plain by road. For decades, this was treated as an interesting footnote. Then, starting in 2011, a team led by Mike Parker Pearson began excavating the Preseli Hills directly. And what they found turned a footnote into one of the most disturbing puzzles in British archaeology. At two outcrops, Craigros I Phelan and Carn Godog, they found clear evidence of deliberate quarrying. Stone wedges still lodged in extraction points, platforms built to ease the stones down from the rock face, and radiocarbon dates showing this quarrying activity happened around 3000 BCE, a full 500 years before the bluestones were supposedly erected at Stonehenge. Something had been done with these stones for half a millennium before they ever reached Salisbury Plain, and nobody could explain what. The excavators also found traces of what looked like a working camp near the quarries, hearths, worked flint tools, and animal bone, evidence of people living on site for extended periods while they extracted and prepared these stones, not a quick raid on a convenient outcrop, but a sustained, organized operation. The answer came in 2021, and it is one of the strangest findings in the monument's history. Just 3 kilometers from the Preseli quarries, researchers excavating a field called Waunmon found the empty sockets of a dismantled stone circle, roughly the same diameter as the earliest phase of Stonehenge, oriented toward the same summer solstice sunrise, with one surviving socket whose cross-section matched a distinctive bluestone still standing at Stonehenge today. The implication is almost too strange to say out loud. Stonehenge may not have started as an original creation on Salisbury Plain at all. It may have started as someone else's monument, built and used in Wales for centuries, then deliberately taken apart, stone by stone, and dragged over 200 kilometers to be rebuilt on English soil. If that theory holds, Stonehenge is not a first edition. It is a second-hand monument carrying with it whatever meaning, memory, or authority the original Welsh circle already held for the people who dismantled it. Moving 4-ton stones 240 kilometers without wheels, metal tools, or draft animals sounds impossible until you look at what experimental archaeologists have actually managed to reproduce. In 2021, a team working with Parker Pearson's project built a wooden sledge running on 2 parallel wooden rails, greased with tallow, and found that as few as 10 people could pull a 2-ton stone along it at a slow, steady pace, far fewer than the earlier estimates of over 100 laborers. Scale up for the heavier stones and difficult terrain, and researchers now believe teams of a few dozen people, not armies, could realistically have hauled these stones across Wales in a matter of weeks, not years. That does not make the achievement small. It makes it precise. This was not brute force. It was engineering, timed, coordinated, and repeated over a journey most of us would find exhausting in a modern vehicle. The stones themselves are not the only thing hiding beneath this landscape. In 2020, a team led by Vincent Gaffney at the University of Bradford announced the discovery of a ring of enormous pits surrounding Durrington Walls, a massive henge monument just 3 kilometers from Stonehenge. Using a combination of ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and soil coring, without digging a single trench, the team mapped at least 20 shafts, each over 10 meters wide and 5 meters deep, arranged in a rough circle more than 2 kilometers across, the largest prehistoric structure of its kind ever found in Britain. Radiocarbon dating placed the shafts to around 2500 BCE, the exact period Stonehenge's main stone phase was being built. Nobody is certain what the shafts were for. Proposed explanations range from a boundary marking sacred ground around Durrington to an enormous calendrical or cosmological structure on a scale that dwarfs Stonehenge itself. But the discovery proved something important. The wider Stonehenge landscape holds monumental features we still have not found, features large enough to be visible from space, yet completely invisible to the human eye at ground level. And we only found this one because remote sensing technology got good enough to see through solid earth. Just over a kilometer from Stonehenge lies a site called Blick Mead, a natural spring that archaeologist David Jacques has been excavating since 2005. What his team found there predates the stone circle by roughly 1,000 years. Layers of burnt flint, animal bone, and charcoal from repeated large-scale feasting, dated as far back as 4000 BCE during the Mesolithic period, long before farming even reached this part of Britain. Some of the aurochs bones recovered show cut marks from butchering animals large enough to feed hundreds of people at once. This tells us something the stones alone never could. Salisbury Plain was already considered special, already a gathering place worth traveling to and feasting at, for 1,000 years before anyone raised a single sarsen. Whoever built Stonehenge was not choosing an empty field. They were formalizing in permanent stone a location that generations of hunter-gatherers, people with no agriculture, no permanent settlements, and no metal tools of any kind, had already decided was sacred ground. Which brings us back to the discovery that broke the story wide open. The altar stone had always been catalogued alongside the bluestones, assumed by default to have come from the same general region of Wales, even though its mineral composition never quite matched the Preseli dolerite. For years, this mismatch was treated as a minor inconsistency, the kind of loose thread every field of archaeology has a few of. In August 2024, a team led by Anthony Clark at Curtin University in Australia, working with Nick Pearce at Aberystwyth University in Wales, decided to actually pull that thread. They extracted microscopic grains of 2 minerals, zircon and rutile, from fragments of the altar stone and dated them using a laser technique precise enough to read the age of crystals smaller than a grain of sand. The age pattern they found, a distinctive mix of crystals dating to roughly 1 billion, 1.6 billion, and 2.7 billion years old, did not match any known rock formation in Wales. It matched the Orcadian Basin, a geological region stretching across the far northeast of Scotland, including Caithness and the Orkney Islands, more than 750 kilometers from Stonehenge by any land route available at the time. Sit with that distance for a moment. 750 kilometers is roughly the distance from London to the southern tip of Italy. It is further than the entire length of Great Britain traveled overland, no wheeled cart, no domesticated horse strong enough to pull that kind of load, existed in Neolithic Britain at that time. Which means the 6-ton altar stone almost certainly did not travel by land at all. The leading theory now is that it moved by sea, transported along the coastline by boat, either as cargo lashed to log rafts or in a large seagoing vessel, then brought inland along river systems to reach Salisbury Plain. That single hypothesis rewrites what we thought we knew about Neolithic Britain. It suggests a maritime transport network stretching the length of the island, coordinated trade or exchange relationships between communities, separated by hundreds of kilometers of open water and hostile coastline, and a level of long-distance social connection between Neolithic Scotland and Neolithic Wessex that almost no archaeologist was seriously proposing before 2024. As Clark's team put it in their published findings, moving a stone of this size across that distance points to a level of societal organization in Neolithic Britain that has been significantly underestimated. The altar stone discovery did not just move a rock on a map. It broke the internal logic of how researchers had organized Stonehenge's story for 100 years. If the Welsh bluestones show evidence of a dismantled sister monument, and the giant sarsens came from a forest 25 kilometers away, and the single most important stone at the very center of the ring came from the opposite end of the island entirely, then Stonehenge stops looking like a local project built by one community. It starts looking like a monument deliberately assembled from pieces carrying meaning from every corner of Neolithic Britain, as if the builders were not just constructing a temple, but physically compressing the entire island into a single sacred space. The mystery does not end with where the stones came from. It continues with what the monument actually does once you stand inside it, and this is where acoustic science enters the picture. In 2019 and 2020, acoustician Trevor Cox led a study using both a precise scale model of Stonehenge and a full-size 1990s concrete replica of the monument built in Maryhill, Washington in the United States, which conveniently still has all of its stones intact, unlike the original. By testing sound propagation through both models, Cox's team confirmed that the enclosed stone circle would have significantly amplified and reverberated sound for anyone standing inside it, functioning acoustically closer to a concert hall or a place of worship than an open field. Voices, drumming, or chanting inside the ring would have sounded noticeably different and more powerful than the same sounds made just outside the stones. Crucially, the study also found that this amplification effect would barely have been noticeable to anyone standing outside the circle. Whatever acoustic experience Stonehenge was built to create, it was designed for the people allowed inside, not for an audience listening from a distance. That detail matters, because it suggests access to the interior of the monument may have been restricted, a private ritual space rather than a public spectacle. Cox's team also modeled how the acoustics would have changed as the monument was built up in stages, and found that the enclosed, reverberant sound world we associate with the finished trilithons simply did not exist in the earliest phases of the site, when it was still an open earthwork with wooden posts. The acoustic experience of Stonehenge, in other words, was not an accidental byproduct of arranging heavy stones in a circle. It intensified deliberately as the monument evolved, growing more enclosed and more resonant with each major building phase, which strongly suggests the builders were responding to how the space sounded and adjusting their construction accordingly, whether or not they had any formal understanding of the acoustic physics behind it. Then there is the astronomy, which is both the most famous feature of Stonehenge and, more recently, the most contested. Everyone knows the summer solstice alignment, the sunrise lining up over the heel stone when viewed from the center of the monument, a relationship that has been documented since the 18th century. Far fewer people know about the ongoing scientific argument over what that alignment and the monument's broader layout was actually for. In 2022, archaeologist Timothy Darville published a paper in the journal Antiquity proposing that the 30 sarsen stones of the central circle functioned as a solar calendar, each stone representing a day within a month, organized into a system that tracked a 365 and a quarter day solar year, similar in concept to calendar systems used later in ancient Egypt. It is a compelling idea, and it generated global headlines. It is also disputed. Other researchers, including members of Parker Pearson's own team, published direct rebuttals arguing that the numerical patterns Darville relied on require selective counting of stones that may not have originally existed in the numbers his theory needs, and that the evidence for a fully developed calendar system at this date remains far from settled. I am telling you both sides because that is the honest state of the research right now. Stonehenge tracks the sun, that part is proven. Whether it was a functioning calendar device, a religious marker, or something closer to both, remains an open and genuinely unresolved argument between serious scientists, not a mystery that has already been solved by anyone. What is far less contested, and in some ways more haunting, is what the human remains at Stonehenge tell us about the people connected to it. Excavations of the Aubrey Holes, a ring of 56 pits inside the earthwork enclosure, have recovered cremated bone from at least 58 individuals, making Stonehenge one of the largest known late Neolithic cremation cemeteries in Britain. In 2018, a study led by Christoph Snook analyzed strontium isotopes preserved in some of these cremated remains, a chemical signature that reflects the geology of wherever a person spent their childhood eating and drinking. A significant number of these individuals showed isotope signatures consistent with growing up in Western Britain, in a region that includes the Preseli Hills of Wales, rather than locally around Salisbury Plain. In other words, some of the people whose remains were buried at Stonehenge appear to have grown up hundreds of kilometers away, in the same region the bluestones came from, and either traveled to Salisbury Plain during their lives or had their remains carried there after death, arriving alongside the very stones their community may have helped quarry. Nearby, the grave of a man now known as the Amesbury Archer, buried around 2300 BCE, just 5 kilometers from Stonehenge with one of the richest collections of grave goods ever found from this period in Britain, showed isotope and genetic signatures suggesting he grew up not in Britain at all, but in the Alpine region of continental Europe, part of the Bell-Beaker migration that was transforming British populations at almost exactly the same period the monument's later stone phases were being built. That migration deserves its own moment of attention, because the genetic story is arguably as shocking as anything found in the stones. A landmark 2018 ancient DNA study published in Nature, led by researchers at the Natural History Museum in London and the Harvard Medical School, analyzed hundreds of prehistoric skeletons from across Britain and found that within just a few centuries of the Beaker culture's arrival from continental Europe, around 2450 BCE onward, roughly 90% of the genetic ancestry of the British population had been replaced. The people whose descendants were still modifying and using Stonehenge in its later centuries were, genetically speaking, largely not the descendants of the people who began building it. This means the monument outlived not just its original architect's generation, but very possibly the entire population group that first conceived it. Inherited by newcomers who kept the site alive, kept adding to it, kept treating it as sacred, without necessarily knowing exactly why their predecessors built it the way they did. A monument surviving a complete population turnover and still being actively used and respected is almost unheard of anywhere else in prehistoric Europe. Put all of these threads together and a picture starts to form that is stranger, and honestly more impressive than the version most documentaries tell. This was not an isolated community of farmers building a monument in a vacuum. This was a site connected by stone, by human remains, and very possibly by direct travel to Wales, to continental Europe, and now, thanks to a single sandstone slab and a laser-dated zircon crystal, to Scotland as well. The organizational capacity this implies, coordinating quarrying, transport by land and likely by sea, construction, and long-distance social relationships, all without writing, without metal tools, and without the wheel, is not evidence of some lost superior civilization. It is evidence that we have been consistently underestimating what Neolithic societies were actually capable of, and the 2024 Alterstone discovery is proof that even the most heavily studied monument on Earth can still humble the people studying it. There's also a quieter, more uncomfortable point buried in all of this. Every one of these breakthroughs, the sarsens sourcing, the Welsh quarries, the Wanmon circle, the Alterstone's Scottish origin, came from technology that simply did not exist a generation ago. Portable X-ray fluorescence scanners, laser ablation mass spectrometry, precise enough to date individual sand-sized crystals, isotope analysis, sensitive enough to trace a single cremated bone fragment back to a childhood diet in another region entirely. None of this was available to the archaeologists who first proposed the standard story of Stonehenge in the 20th century, which raises the obvious question. If the last 5 years of laboratory science overturned assumptions that had stood since the 1920s, what happens when the next generation of scanning and dating technology gets applied to the roughly 95% of the wider Stonehenge landscape that has never been excavated at all, protected as it is under UNESCO World Heritage status specifically, because digging destroys the very context researchers need to interpret it correctly, leaving most of what remains buried until a future generation of scientists, with tools we cannot yet imagine, decides it is finally time to look again. We are, right now, living through the most active period of Stonehenge research in over a century, and the site keeps refusing to give up its secrets quietly. Every confirmed answer, where the sarsens came from, where the bluestones came from, where the Alterstone came from, has generated new and harder questions in return. How did a 6-ton stone actually travel 750 kilometers by sea using Neolithic boats we have never found intact? Why dismantle an existing stone circle in Wales, rather than simply building fresh at Salisbury Plain? Was the calendar theory a genuine ancient system or a modern pattern imposed onto an ambiguous layout? Nobody currently studying this monument claims to have final answers to any of these questions, and that honesty is exactly what makes the real story more compelling than any invented one. 4,500 years ago, a community with no writing, no metal, and no wheels looked at raw stones scattered across an entire island and decided to gather pieces of Wales, pieces of local Wiltshire, and, we now know, a piece of Scotland, and assemble them into a structure built to outlast every one of them. It has now outlasted the ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids after it, the Roman Empire that rose and fell around it, and every civilization since. The scans keep getting sharper, the questions keep getting bigger, and Stonehenge, after 45 centuries of silence, is still only just beginning to tell us the truth. Consider what that actually means for the next decade of research. The altar stone was hiding in plain sight for over 300 years of formal antiquarian study, examined, sketched, and catalogued by generations of scholars who simply lacked the tools to read what was written inside its own crystal structure. If a stone sitting at the exact center of the most studied prehistoric monument on Earth could keep a secret like that until 2024, it is worth asking, soberly and without exaggeration, what else is sitting in plain sight across the wider landscape, in the unexcavated 95% of the site, in museum drawers, holding decades-old core samples nobody has thought to retest, in cremated bone fragments whose isotope signatures have never been fully cross-referenced against the growing map of Neolithic Britain. Every answer this monument has given up in the last 5 years came from someone deciding to test an old assumption with new equipment rather than accepting the story as it had always been told. That is not a closed case. That is an open invitation. And somewhere in a laboratory right now, the next piece of that 4,500-year-old puzzle is probably already sitting under a microscope, waiting for someone to notice it does not quite match what the textbooks say.